Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you are joining us today. So a very hearty welcome for this session. It's wonderful to have all of our alums joining in on such a valuable session. I know it's going to be great. We are really privileged today to have LaTonya Wilkins with us. I'm going to introduce LaTonya briefly, but I also want to say that I had the privilege of reading her book before it was actually released, which was very exciting for me. And I know you're in for some great insights because I took some great insights out of this book. And I really think it speaks to all of us, regardless of where we are in our careers. LaTonya is the founder of The Change Coaches and the author of Leading Below the Surface. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, with the subheading, How to Build Real and Psychological Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. She specializes in coaching executives on leading below the surface to build psychological safe relationships with teams across differences. And she is a sought after keynote speaker and has inspired audiences all over the world through highly customized coaching, learning sessions, culture academies, and human-centered design services. Her teamwork with executives and upwardly mobile professionals and teams really helps to create cultures of belonging and motivating environments that amplify people throughout the organization, but especially in those teams. LaTonya's work is aimed at helping people feel more valued, more heard, and more engaged. And she's worked with leaders as well as others throughout the organization and companies, including Google, GE, New York Times, and many nonprofit organizations. She built her career in HR, talent management, and learning and development at Fortune 500 companies before teaching and taking on progressive leadership roles at the University of Illinois' Geese College of Business. LaTonya was rated an excellent teacher by her undergraduate business students, and she is also a board member of the LGBTQ Alumni Association at Indiana University. She is currently the president of the True Star Youth Foundation Board, which is a digital media social entrepreneurship company that recently received a Google Impact Award. She's been featured in publications such as Fast Company, Well Plus Good, and Inc. magazine. And she's gained global recognition when she was recognized on the most inclusive HR influencer list in 2019. So LaTonya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. I do want to highlight that our attendees can submit questions in the Q&A function. Allison DeWitt is monitoring that. And as those questions roll in, Allison's going to jump in and provide an avenue for those questions to be asked directly to LaTonya. So please do submit your questions as they come to you. And LaTonya, before we jump into a vast list of questions that we've already generated, I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about yourself. What inspired you to move away from working in Fortune 500 companies and become a coach and consultant, and now an author dedicated to building cultures of belonging?
Yeah, so a little bit about my story. Obviously, it includes Kelley and you as my strategy professor. And my Kelley education actually got my foot in the door at some amazing companies. And so that's how I started my career, is at Fortune 500 companies at post MBA. And I would say, several years into that, I wasn't feeling as fulfilled anymore. I was feeling like I didn't really belong in some of those environments. I felt like a lot of other folks felt like they didn't belong in those environments. I led teams. I led learning and development teams. I led culture teams. And I felt like we weren't really making a lot of progress in creating those environments. And so in my job at the time, my mother had recently passed away. And so after that, I started kind of rethinking what I wanted to do with my life at that point. And so I started networking, and I decided to make a change out of corporate and went to work in higher education at a business school, because I felt like that was a way that I could impact the world and impact future leaders a little bit more. And while I was on that path, I ended up getting my coaching certification. My mentor had always urged me to do that. And I knew that if I did that, I could actually create even more behavioral change in people or inspire more behavioral change in people. So I started doing coaching and like in the traditional sense. And when I finally got my first corporate clients, I started seeing what my talents really were. And that was creating change below the surface, creating change in spaces of vulnerability, creating team change. That first corporate client were two co-founders of a UX design company. And that's what we did. We focused on culture change within their organization while we are also transforming themselves as leaders. And what I did was so impactful. And I started doing it with other clients started bringing in other coaches. And then I thought, hey, what if I made this available to other people? This was in 2020 when there's a lot of racist, there's a lot of systemic racist things that happen, a lot of stress just on people, a lot of loss with people with COVID. And so that's when I started writing this book. It was a calling at that point. I mean, my grandmother was one of those people that really inspired me. And so in her last days, I was thinking about how do I do this? How do I do this? And so that's why I wrote the book. It was really a book that I felt was needed in the world. I felt it was a book that could add value in the world. And I felt like I was ready because I had done that initial reflection that I needed to do in order to create the most impact as possible.
That sounds great. So it was partly the impetus for this book, it sounds like, was partly the cultural elements that you were experiencing personally that drove you into thinking more reflectively about the environment, but also some personal things that were going on in your life. It really inspired you to share your story and share the lessons that you had learned. It sounds like it was a combination of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what Leading Below the Surface is all about. You can't separate. It's really difficult to separate personal. I mean, you have to bring your human self to work. And I didn't really feel like that was something that I was able to do in a lot of the roles that I had.
I think that is really important. And I want to get to this idea of leading below the surface, but you just said something incredibly important, that too many organizations want you to leave your personal self out of the organization. And it's very hard to work in those environments, in those cultures where they're making that separation, but we can't always separate our lives between the personal and the professional. We bring our whole self to work, and the better organization is the one that recognizes you're bringing your whole self to work. So let's dig into that. What does it mean to lead from below the surface? How does that different from what you might call the opposite of surface leader?
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. And I'm going to try to answer that in the shortest way possible. So it all started when I was in a large company and I learned about leadership archetypes. And we all learned what our leadership archetype was. Like we had strategic leaders, innovative leaders, the list goes on and on. And those were kind of like what we were leading, or but not necessarily how we led people. And that was missing in a lot of even the leadership development programs that I created. So I was part of that systemic issue of, how do we lead people? What does that look like? And so I started just throwing myself into a ton of research because I'm like, there's got to be a better way to talk about leadership. And not just, again, how you lead or skills that you need, but, what you lead and the skills that you need, but how you lead people and how you connect with them. And so one of the things I was always inspired by was Amy Edmondson's work in psychological safety. And basically with psychological safety, if some of you haven't heard of that, I'm sure you have, but it's being able to speak up without repercussions and without punishment. It's being able to bring your whole self to work without punishment. And so her work was kind of my first start, or my first opening into, so what is this new way of leading? And then that's through all that culmination of research, that's when I came up with below the surface leadership. And what that means is there are 3 prongs of below the surface leadership I talk about in the book, but it means that, first of all, you're a real leader, so relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. Equity is so important because, again, in a lot of the organizations that I was in developing programs for, equity is kind of like the side dish, but it's actually really integral to a good leader. The second would be empathetic listening. I talk about two different types of ways to access empathy. When I was doing my research, I learned that only 40% of leaders actively practice empathy every day. And a lot don't even know what it is. And even now, when I'm doing talks on empathy, there's a lot of people that are intimidated by that word or intimidated by what could happen if they practice that. And the third is psychological safety. And so through these three prongs, basically you're getting deeper in yourself so you could get deeper with others, so you can naturally create that culture of belonging. You can naturally create that environment that's more human and naturally create that environment that's more welcoming. And that is a great culture. I talk about, because some of you are probably like, well, is that a great culture? Yeah, it's a great culture. I mean, it's like, when I hear that, I'm like, great culture for what? Great culture for who? And those are the questions I ask. And so, yeah, those are the three prongs of below the surface leadership. The opposite is surface leader, and that is the status quo, right? That is the leader that I faced a lot of when I first started my career. They were on the surface level, which meant one of the examples of a surface leader that I had is as I opened up about some of the personal things that happened when I had a loss in the family. A surface leader told me, hey, just take some vacation. We kind of expect you to get back to it next week. And they weren't below the surface with me. Like, they weren't really they weren't being empathetic, first off. I didn't feel psychologically safe for things to happen to me and be able to overcome that. And they weren't practicing real leadership. So those are a couple of examples.
So let me before we dig even further into this, let me talk about the organizations that may have a problem, or the individuals that may have a problem achieving this. And here I'm really trying to get at the roadblocks, the things that prevent the organization or the individual from leading from below the surface. And the example you just gave, it strikes me that there could be a couple of things going on. Maybe the organization culture is to shy away from personal matters and to not dig into the individual's personal circumstances. But it could also be that individual's uncomfortableness in asking and digging into it. So when you think about the things that prevent leaders and organizations from really getting below the surface, what are the major roadblocks that you've seen?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you one that's individual focused and one that's organizational focused, because it's easy to blame the organizations. And the individual focused one, I coach a lot of executives. And so one of the things that I throw out to them is to consider is, why are you waiting for your organization to approve you in your leadership style or your leadership philosophy? It's like, I teach courses at business schools. I don't ask for them to approve of my leadership philosophy. And so when people come to me and they say, especially if I'm coaching them, I ask them to consider that. Like, when you lead your team through day-to-day leadership, do you expect your manager to approve that? Do you expect them to tell you what to do? No, because that comes from your core. It's deeper than that. So everyone can do this, right? I don't want you to feel like, hey, LaTonya, I'm in a toxic culture, it's going to be impossible for me. You can. And I think for those of you that are thinking that, again, I want you to do some deeper work and think about, what do you want your leadership philosophy to be? It's like when I teach students, I have a teaching philosophy, and that teaching philosophy is to basically level the power field. And I'm teaching as a coach, right? And that's okay. That's just my philosophy. No one else needs to approve that. That's what I was made for. So I want all of you to kind of think about, what are you made for, right? You don't need someone to approve your existence, right? And what you are. So organizationally, I will acknowledge that there are what I call suppressive talent processes. And again, in a lot of organizations, I might have cultivated some of these. And one of them is performance management, right? There are a lot of organizations that still call themselves meritocracies, even though when you look at the research, meritocracies are suffocating, they don't work, they're divisive. A lot of them are discriminatory. So if you have those suppressive talent practices and you're a manager and you're expected to like rank your team or, pit them against each other. Again, try to go back to your leadership philosophy and think about how you might be able to subvert some of that. But those are usually the ways. It's usually an individual barrier that you might be putting up. That's more of a mirage. Again, and it's like your own philosophy, or it's like the organization might have things that are suppressive. And even if you love working for this organization, it's still going to have talent practices that you might not agree with. So again, think about how you might be able to subvert some of those.
I think that's a really great illustration of how you can take ownership, you can take responsibility. Even if you find yourself in a challenging culture, there's a lot you can do to really break through and be the kind of leader that your team deserves. I think that's really brilliant in taking ownership of those things, and great advice for all of us. Early in your book, LaTonya, you wrote about KPEs. I wonder if you could explain to our audience, what are KPEs and how do these relate to a leader's style?
Yeah. So the entire second chapter about my book is all about the dominant leadership standard, which I call it in the book. And what that means is that a lot of the standards that we have, a lot of the philosophies that we have, that we teach our students, that we teach within our organizations, were developed by like one type of person. And so I call those KPEs to express that. The same people, that knowledge, perspectives, and experience. So these are people that might have similar knowledge, like they might have went to like elite schools, they might have, done elite research. Perspectives, they might have limited perspectives or similar perspectives and similar experiences. And I talk about KPEs a lot because they're so important, because what I'm finding is when I'm coaching teams, the more limited their KPEs are, the more limited their perspectives are about belonging, the more limited their perspectives are about performance and what that means, the more limited their perspectives are about innovation and what that looks like. And so KPEs are really what set a lot of organizations back when it comes to creating cultures of belonging, growing, connecting with their clients, especially their clients that might look different from them. So this is different from just diversity. It's what knowledge does your team have? What perspectives have they had, and what experiences have they had? One other thing I'll mention from that is I also found research, and I quote that a lot in the book, where different types of people lead differently, right? And I just talked about, again, your philosophy. So there's actually research out there that says, for example, Black women, they might lead differently. They might have different things that they value, as opposed to women that are not Black or LGBTQ leaders. And so that's what KPEs are. It's like there's different types. If you could acknowledge different KPEs and acknowledge that everyone kind of has their own philosophy, their own makeup, then that's where you could start to create that culture of belonging. But a lot of the times it's a non-starter. And I see this a lot when I coach teams, because everyone has the same experiences. A lot of these, for example, tech companies that I work with, they all went to Stanford and they were classmates, and they again, their KPEs are limited. I'm not saying they're not great. I'm just saying they're limited, and it's going to be really hard for them to get outside of that thinking unless they bring other KPEs to the team.
I think that's a really important point. And oftentimes when we're building a team, too often, I should say, we look for people who have the same experiences that we do, have the same knowledge sets that we do. In the illustration you gave, went to the same school as us, grew up in the same place as us, have the same perspectives. And so what is it that we should do as leaders to break from that mold? What are some tips that you have for us so that we don't fall back on comfort level of only bringing people who look and have the same experiences as us?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in chapter 3, I talk about the terrible 3 biases, and I talk about biases that all humans have. And those biases are affinity bias, confirmation bias, and in-group bias. everybody has them. It doesn't matter who you are, what your KPIs are, everybody has those. And so I would say that first acknowledging, let's talk about affinity bias, because that's one of the number ones I see. We're Kelley alum, so we might see a Kelley alum resume sitting in front of us and we're like, yeah, I know that person's going to work hard. I know they're going to roll their sleeves up. I know, because these are all the things we do, right, as Kelley grads. And so I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I'm saying you just need to acknowledge that. So if you are, for example, opening up a new position on your team and you're looking to bring in someone a little bit different, I want you to sit down and think about your affinity bias and how that might affect the process, how that might affect it for good, like how that might be a benefit. And then how might that detract from the process, detract from you bringing in other candidates, and doing that reflection up front. What situations would be better for that? But first, we have to acknowledge that we have this, and then also start asking ourselves that question: is this worth it? Is it needed? And where should I be compromising this? Where I'm not just looking for Kelley alums, or I'm looking for a different type of alum, or I'm looking for maybe this position doesn't even need a degree. So again, it's understanding we all have these biases, understanding what yours are in particular, and evaluating and reflecting on those, so you can kind of understand if it's coming into the process and how to change that.
I really like how you encapsulate a theme that goes through your book, and that is at various points in time, you need to be reflective of the practices you use, need to actually think carefully, write down these things, take some action. And your book is literally filled with points that we can really take direct action, take direct influence in terms of our own behavior. And I think that's a great example. Do we really need to have these criteria? What do they do for us? What do they hinder us in terms of our assessment, our evaluation? And really being reflective of it. And I think the purposeful nature of what you're talking about really can help us break some habits that aren't needed, that aren't valuable, that aren't necessary. So I like the way you highlight that. Allison, do we have a question?
We do. If you don't mind going back to a point you were speaking on, LaTonya, a few moments ago, we have a question asking if you wouldn't mind to expand a bit upon your statement about meritocracies being suffocating. This individual says this is the first time they've heard of this perspective, and are interested in hearing maybe a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so there's a study in my book that I quote Emilio Castillo, he from MIT, and he actually did a study on multiple companies, and he couldn't say who they were, but I think I have an idea of the company that he was surveying, because I've worked for a lot of these companies, or I've worked in learning and development, and I've studied a lot of these companies. But basically what he found is that in these meritocratic cultures, the people that lost out the most were people that were usually othered. So they were people that were immigrants, or maybe it's an American company, so they were considered, outside of the US, people of color, and then women. And so these folks, when they're trying to evaluate them on a performance management basis, even if they worked just as hard, they didn't get the same ratings. And so it shows that it's impossible for it to work, because there's so much bias in the system that it's impossible. There's also a thing with meritocracies that I've experienced, because again, I was behind the scenes developing a lot of these performance programs. And what it did is it pits people against each other. So it encourages competition over collaboration. So for example, I worked for a couple companies where I redesigned their entire performance process. And what we decided to do was have, pay for performance plans. So if you were, a higher performer, you got paid more than lower performers. And what we found is in those companies that people were competing, and they weren't sharing information. They were trying to be better rather than, connecting with their teammates. And so these are a few things to think about. I'm not saying it can't work at all. It's just extremely difficult, especially if you are trying to create a workplace full of collaboration, full of innovation, full of belonging. It's very, very hard to do.
So you've given us an example of a company or described a company that where it doesn't work. Have you seen companies where they've been very effective in creating this atmosphere of belonging, this culture of collaboration? Can you give us a few examples of companies where that works really in a favorable manner?
You mean the meritocracy or just the cultures of collaboration?
Sorry, cultures of collaboration.
Yeah. So I see it all the time. So when I'm brought in, I do a couple different things. Usually I'll coach executive teams, or I'll start with executive teams, and then I'll start doing some work within the organization, listening sessions. And the number one thing that comes up is siloed mentality. And this siloed mentality is usually starts around either the company being geographically dispersed, or there being certain teams that are put on a pedestal, or they're more valued than other teams. And so building that culture of collaboration, where I've seen it with these organizations when I work with them, it creates more of an opportunity for people to share ideas, for people to feel like more psychologically safe, for people to feel like their opinions count, for people to feel like their opinions matter. When you neutralize that power, people feel more engaged, like they feel more important. They feel like they could see themselves in the company. They feel more tied to the company goals. And so this is a common problem where, again, there's these silos. I think during COVID and being able to work remotely and blowing some of this out of the water, being able to see it has helped a little bit, at least with understanding that it can be a problem. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done, again, within structures and systems to kind of encourage this behavior, a culture of this behavior on an ongoing basis.
It's interesting that you brought up the issue of COVID and remote work, because there are many organizations that are struggling now with how much to bring people back and how to I'm going to use those words, rebuild the culture that existed pre-COVID. And I think they're struggling with this. And it seems to me that these below the surface leaders could potentially play a huge role in ensuring that the culture remains strong, even when you have a high level of remote work, high level of people working 2 days remote or 5 days remote for that matter.
Yeah.
So I think that below the surface leaders are going to be even more important as we move forward in the post-COVID period. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was just having this conversation with a client yesterday, and I facilitated a retreat for them, and they need to be more innovative, and they have all these really smart people, but they've been still working 100% remote. And then they came into this retreat and they were so excited, and there's so much more that needs to be done. And they're struggling defining how to do this because employees still want to work from home, but it's really hard to be 100% remote and be innovative, be productive. The companies that I've seen do it, they're spending a lot on technology. And so if you could do that, fine, like some places, but they're spending a lot. But how does below the surface leadership come into this? Well, it's understanding why your employees want to work the way they do, and having empathy towards that. Understanding, equity, and are you being equitable on who can work from home and who cannot work from home? Is coming into the office perceived as punishment, or is it perceived as something positive culturally that people can enjoy and people can get excited about? Are you loyal through the changes of this happening, right? Are you loyal to the ups and downs of, hey, hybrid, remote, like what is COVID going to do today? Is it going to turn again next month? But being loyal to that, just being loyal to the mess. And I call that like also meandering in the muck, but it's that's why below the surface leadership is important, because we're going to continue. The future of work is going to be issues like this, that there's not going to be a straight line. There's not going to be a straight answer. And so that real leadership is going to be so necessary, because even something just as small as remote hybrid, how does this work? You're going to need to have those types of skills and that type of approach in order to navigate that successfully.
Right. And it seems to me that it's very easy for people to get lost in the back and forth that you just described. And for people who may be doing great work to not get the recognition they deserve. So the onus is on the leader to really make sure they're inclusive and understanding of the circumstances that everybody's dealing with. And I want to go through one specific expression that you use in the book. You write about, you said the below the surface fallback is empathy. So not only do I need you to explain to everyone what a fallback is, but why is empathy such an important tool in below the surface leader?
Oh my gosh, empathy can get you through almost everything as a leader. And I even say, so if you are someone, especially that maybe you got promoted into a big job, and I get calls from people like this all the time that want to coach, and they're like, oh my gosh, I just got promoted to this big job, which I do in my first 90 days. Listen, be empathetic. That's all you have to do. Like, I think we have to have this list of things and list of accomplishments that we have to have. No, just listen, be empathetic. And so that's the fallback. That's what I mean by the fallback. So if you are that new leader that I just spoke about, or you are someone that wants to create a culture of belonging, where do you start? Well, you start with empathy. And what does that mean? Well, I talk about two different ways to access that in the book. I talk about person-to-person listening, kind of like how Idie and I are talking now. Like, we are listening to each other, playing things back. Our phones aren't in front of us. We have no distractions. We are able to fully be present for each other. And we can see that because of our body language. We can see it because of, what we're hearing from each other, all of that. Like, we're really aligned right now. All of you can do this with your team. And I encourage you to continue to do this in your one-on-ones, right? I think it's so easy just to be pulled everywhere and have your phone out, and Slack. Oh my gosh, Slack for leaders is such a distraction, but try to turn those off. The second way to do this is what I call person to belonging listening. And that's listening through observing. And so that's being able to show up to your new team and look around and see how they interact. Like, first, that's your first step, is to have a team meeting and you don't even say anything. You just want to see how the team interacts. Like, you don't want to come in trying to steer the ship. You can learn so much more from that than from staff interviews, for example. And so that's what I mean by empathy being a fallback first. Not only will you learn a lot, you will connect a lot. People respond to that. There's, when you think about neuroscience, oxytocin is released, which is like a bonding chemical in your brain, when you are truly empathetic. And so those are some reasons, again, learning, releasing that oxytocin, building that trust with your team. And it's easy to access relatively. I know when we talk about psychological safety, it feels esoteric. There's many steps there, but empathy, anyone can be a good listener. Anyone could step in and do this. So that's why it's a fallback, which means, like, if you're reading the book or you're going through something, you're like, gosh, this is a lot to remember. All you have to remember is empathy for that day. That's it.
I think that's great. And Allison, before you jump in, I just want our listeners to understand the point that was just made. Too often, leaders think they must be active, they must be doing something, they must be taking control or taking charge of a situation. And what LaTonya just reminded us of is that you can actually take a step back and be a good leader by listening, by showing empathy, by being in the background sometimes, not always being in the foreground, and allowing the team to demonstrate their capabilities, and then you building off of that. And I think, LaTonya, that's such a very important point, because I think leaders have the misconception that only when they are acting and in the foreground are they being good leaders. And that's simply not the case. Allison, what do you have for us?
Absolutely. I have a feeling that some of these themes that you're talking about might apply to this question. So that's why I'm popping in now. And also continue to send us questions. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A. But this question is, it says, our society is politically polarized. Do you see the polarization permeating organizations at all? And if so, how do you deal with this?
That's an interesting question. So gosh, I love that question, because when I talked about the terrible three biases, as a coach, I don't tell anyone what to do. I just give them the knowledge and the context, and I have them reflect on it. But one of those terrible three biases is in-group bias. And when you're talking about political polarization, that's in-group bias. That is, I am so aligned politically here that I can't even be empathetic to anyone else. I can't even, and the Manchester United study, I'm sure some of you have heard about this, but it was all about, someone falling, like someone from a rival team falling on the ground with that rival jersey on, tripping and falling in front of people. And if you had the rival jersey on, they wouldn't even help them up, right? They wouldn't even help them up. But if they had the same jersey on, they would, right? And so that's that strong in-group bias. And if you want to be a true below the surface leader, you have to acknowledge that in-group bias, and it's going to be really hard to do if you maintain that, right? Again, asking yourself, why is that bias so strong? What is that getting you? I also talk about humans excluding to belong. So they want to belong to this group so much and build this affiliation that they exclude everybody else. And so that's how I tackle this. I personally, I don't see that a lot when I am coaching teams, even though politically people might have different views. We don't even talk about it in that context or in that language. What we might talk about it as, and what resonates, is the in-group versus out-group bias or affinity bias. And so if we can kind of tackle that, then I think we are a step closer to, moving forward collectively. And as you're saying, through these factions of what, the world could look like politically. So hopefully that answers the question, but it's really thinking about this from a different language and a different perspective, that again, it's that bias, and how is that bias holding us back from connecting with people who are different from us?
You had to think about a new leader, someone who's just maybe coming out of school and they're taking on a new leadership position, and you wanted to give them advice in terms of demonstrating some of the most important things they could do. One of the things you've talked about is that empathy notion. Another thing you've talked about is being a good listener. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other things that a brand new leader can do to demonstrate that they're approachable, to demonstrate mm-hmm. that they can be, that I'm willing and able to connect with you?
Yeah. So I think the first one is empathy. And again, showing up and showing your team that you're empathetic, for both one-on-one and within that group, not trying to steer the ship. The second is psychological safety, and really noodling with this with your team or experimenting with your team. I have so many leaders that come to me and they're like, I really want to build a psychologically safe team. Give me a checklist. Doesn't work that way, right? There are little things that you can do. But to start off, what you could say is, look, everyone, I just learned about this fascinating concept called psychological safety. And it takes inclusion kind of even a step further. And what I would like to do is understand what this means to you, right? Here's some literature on it. Here's a few pages to read on it. But let's talk about what it means to you. And how could we foster this in the team? And having these discussions, have it more than once and talk about when it happens and when it doesn't happen. This can even be a part of like your team meetings. Like, oh, when did you feel psychologically safe? When did you not feel psychologically safe? How could we change? And that, again, that's another way that you can win your staff over. Again, if you are practicing these things like empathy, psychological safety, real leadership, and again, that equity and that loyalty are also really important as well.
I think you've just given us another great example of the style that you're hoping that we can learn from. And the example is rather than coming in and saying, all right, we're going to talk about psychological safety. This is what it means.
Yes.
I'm the font of telling you this is what it means. The example you gave us is, what does it mean to you? If we want to create an atmosphere or culture of psychological safety, let's first talk about what you think it means and examples of when you've experienced this versus when you haven't experienced this, and allowing people to share those experiences, share those personal examples that they have, is a demonstration of psychological safety, right? In and of itself. And so you're actually demonstrating the very thing you want people to talk about. And I think that's just a great example of creating that team, that atmosphere that's going to give people a level of comfort that they can bring their whole self to work. So great example. Again, I want to go back to this idea of creating the right culture and creating the right strategy. And I want to build this into DEIB, so very important today. The mindset of creating an effective DEIB strategy for organizations. You write about getting below the surface with DEIB, and that starts with an expression you used just a moment ago, meandering in the muck. Can we revisit that expression and also talk about its relationship to the concept of building a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and belonging environment?
Yeah, so the meandering in the muck is, there's an example that, I was coaching a leader on the other day, and they were having a really hard time with someone on their team, and they weren't really sure why, and they were feeling bad about it, but they felt like they were trying everything, but it wasn't working. And so I told that person to basically, what I call, meander in the muck, and think about what is really standing in the way of you building a relationship with this person. And I kind of know, I have my intuitions around what it is. It's that this person is polar opposites. It's that this person, they've never hired anyone like this before. They were trying to hire someone like this for a long time, but they could not. And so it's getting in that muck and admitting that there could be some bias, or there could be some fear of this person and what they might do in your team, or maybe they're triggering things that are coming up for you that maybe came up in your past with other people. And so really meandering in that muck. The second way of meandering in the muck is, and I talked about this a lot, especially during the pandemic, is if someone on your team brings you a personal issue and you are not expecting it, all below the surface leaders should do is empathize, right? You're not trying to solve the problem. You're not trying to get them to be quiet. You're not trying to get them to be over it. All you're doing is empathizing. And that is meandering in the muck, especially if it's an issue that you've never dealt with before. Because we have this culture sometimes in just the world, in the US, where we're like, well, if I dealt with it, I could give them some advice. But if I don't really know about this, you don't have to know about it. All you have to do is empathize. And that can be extremely hard. And that's what I mean by that muck, is you've probably been programmed to kind of solve it or say, okay, I'm going to send you to the EAP program or do all these things. But no, just stay in that muck with them, stay on that level with them. And, maybe at the end of that, then you can say, would you like for me to give you some resources? Because I can send some for you. Or would you like for me just to continue listening? And that's what I mean by that muck, is it's mucky, it's uncomfortable. It's that discomfort that we're like, gosh, this is the part of the leadership I don't really like. Like, I wish people didn't bring this to work because I don't really know how to deal with it. And that's, again, I'm not saying that if your employees are having huge problems where they need, mental health assistance, that's one thing. But if it's a day-to-day thing, try that empathy and try meandering in that muck with them.
I think that's another great example. And you started off by talking about someone who was not very empathetic and in a personal situation that you faced, a death that you were trying to cope with, and basically telling you to get over it a little bit more politely than that. Right.
Right.
And here you're reminding us that just the listening part of it, the human part of it, is so valuable to someone. And then at the end, if there are resources that you can provide after you've listened, after you've shown empathy, after you've connected with them at a human level, then there is that next step that you can offer. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I just think most people feel uncomfortable dealing with this.
Yeah,
Whether they
absolutely.
don't have the experience, or they just simply don't feel comfortable, at that personal level. And so building your leadership capabilities seems to me to be part connected to understanding how to develop that connection, that relationship. Allison, what have you got?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions come in around collaboration and building a culture of collaboration. So because we've had a few, and because I feel like when we're talking about the culture of collaboration is a thing that we hear a lot. It's talked about a lot. It's a value that I think a lot of our companies and the organizations we work with hold. But LaTonya, what does that really truly mean to you? What does a successfully collaborative organization look like? What are maybe some of those things they're doing?
It's not just setting up ERGs, which is usually it's building communities. So I recently wrote an article about what is a community versus a group, and especially because I get asked a lot about this for ERGs. ERGs come to me a lot, and it's a group is just a group of people coming together at any given time. A community is a space that is cultivating relationships. It's safe for people. People can bring their whole selves to that community. And so it's first off, it's building communities. It's moving from groups to communities. So if you have communities in your organization, what does that look like? The second way is this takes a long time, and you first have to start with the leadership team, and like, are they collaborating? Like, what are they? And I can go in and observe, and there's got to be structures in place that encourage collaboration, not just in the organization, but on the leadership team. And I'm not saying it always has to be top down, but if they don't think this way, then they're not going to ask their teams to think this way. And that one example is, again, how are people rewarded in the organization? Are they rewarded individually? Are they awarded by teams? Are they awarded collaboratively? I think also working in teams, but here's the thing, and I talk about this in my book, that sometimes people feel like they're on way too many teams these days. So again, being very intentional about your teams, making sure they're not groups, making sure they're actually productive teams that are sharing ideas. And the other way that is really important is neutralizing power in the organization. That's another way where you could build collaboration. And what I mean by that is, again, like, you have to make it in your culture and create a space in your culture where people feel psychologically safe, and they feel like they can express their ideas, and they can, for example, one company I was working with, one of their employees had asked, hey, I have a new product for our company. I want our company to think about this new product. And in that culture, since I'd worked with them for quite a while, she was able to know that she didn't have to get approval. She could just kind of talk this over with some of her communities and then talk to the founders about this idea. And so that's what a culture of collaboration looks like. Again, since that power had been neutralized and there wasn't like an approval process for ideas, she cultivated that before she even took it up to the next level, because she knew that they were going to be interested either way, right? And so those are some ways. Again, try to neutralize that power. Think about, like, at the top, like, how are they rewarded? Think about how people are rewarded. And 3, building communities over groups. The community piece is so important because I want everybody to think about all the communities they're in, and think about how easy it is to bring up things, right? How easy it is to bring up ideas, how easy it is to celebrate successes. So if you can't do all three of those, just trying to focus on that would be important.
LaTonya, as you think about your role as a coach, I'm sure you've seen many, many examples of people that you have coached over time. I'm wondering, are there very common instances that you've seen repeated over and over, which keep leaders from really getting to that below the surface level? Common, I'll use the word mistakes, but common things that they encounter that we can learn from in the few minutes that we have left, how we can avoid some of those problems.
Yeah, I would say the number one problem that I see is that, again, people have these outdated expectations of what leaders are supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And they get really, I mean, I know this sounds silly, but it's really, they get really defensive, and it's really hard to let those go. It's really hard. And to think about it, like, if you've been, if you worked your way up from, a individual contributor to like, close to the C-suite or in the C-suite, it's really hard to rethink those behaviors. And so how do I do that? Well, it's just through, weeks and weeks of reflection and coaching and just challenging what your standards are, why they are your standards. Sometimes, I'll coach a leader and it's like, they're like, well, this is what the organization expects. And then it's really not. And again, it's like, I think we get conditioned so much. And that's why I focus so much as a coach on behavioral change and questioning of, how you're thinking and how you're approaching things. And so that's the main thing. So I want everyone, if nothing else today, just maybe jot down what you think a leader is supposed to be, or what you were trained that a leader should be, and can challenge if that's really true or not. And if it's, and also note if you're feeling really uncomfortable with even challenging this and where that's coming from. So hopefully that's helpful, but that's honestly, that is the number one thing. And I think that old world leadership is not compatible with belonging. I mean, if McKinsey just published something that said belonging is the number one thing that employees want in the workplace. And that's not what the old world leadership model says. So
yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, years ago, we used to talk about more collaborative leaders versus authoritative leaders, but we're in a whole different realm now. And we need to go to that next step. And I think what you talked about is it's so easy to be defensive. We expect those who work with us, our team and our employees, we expect them to receive feedback. But then the question is, are we being defensive ourselves, or are we open to the kinds of messaging that tell us whether we're really focused on a more inclusive, more belonging kind of environment? And I think you really stated it well. We need to take our guard down and be open. And when you open yourself up to others' insights about you and about your leadership style, then you can begin changing it. So I think that was very well stated, very well stated. I know we are just about out of time. Allison, I'm going to call on you. I know you have a couple of things that you want to say as well. And LaTonya, you may have some announcements about things that you're going to be doing coming up. And I know you might want to share that with our audience as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean Kesner and LaTonya. I really enjoyed listening to this conversation, and I hope so have everyone else. And I thank you for those of you who sent in questions too. We were able to get through most of those. One last question I do want to address. We've been asked if we're able to share resources or anything like that. And yes, I will absolutely send a follow-up email in the coming days with a link to the recording, more information on how to get LaTonya's book. Yep. But also, there it is. Perfect.
There it is. And I do want to say, and I want to add, there are amazing resources in the book. And so LaTonya really goes through a lot of research and a lot of work, and she brings that into the book. So you don't have to read all of the work that serves as the backbone for this, but you're going to get lots of great insights from really outstanding work that's been done. So I highly recommend it.
Absolutely. And then LaTonya, did you have any other resources or things coming up you want people to know about?
Yeah, I mean, so if you really like everything you heard today, you could go to leadingbelowthesurface.com. We have a 30-day Leading Below the Surface Leadership Challenge that you can try. It's I was getting a lot of folks that were like, wait, I've read the book and I really want to dig in a little bit more. So that's what the 30-day challenge. We also have a discussion guide. So if you are reading it with a team or you want to bring it to your company's book group, you can use the discussion guide as well. There's lots of tools out there. And so, yeah, everybody can do this. It's honestly, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, to be sitting here with my strategy professor, that was an awesome strategy professor that I learned so much from, is amazing. And so yeah, all of us can do this, and let's be better. Let's all make a commitment to do that.
Agreed.
And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, LaTonya. It's been wonderful having you share your experiences and also share your insights. We thank you so much, and congratulations on the book. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it. I know I learned a lot of lessons from the book, and I'm sure you can too.